This is NAPE member meeting, our member series. It's our monthly series, bringing together our community to talk about issues that are important to you as NAPE members. This particular topic, storytelling, humanizing data in CTE, was something that was raised through feedback that we've gotten through our member surveys coming directly from our state education agencies. So thank you very much for the feedback. I'm Gregory Jackson. I'm Associate Director for Membership and Partnership. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. And we really appreciate you coming in and taking time, particularly around this time of year. I know it's crunch time and you all could be doing a whole bunch of other things, perhaps dipping into some eggnog at your staff meeting. But here we are. So thank you again for joining us. I just want to share with you a little bit about membership at NAPE. This meeting is part of what we do in terms of member engagement. Our engagement goals are to support what I call the 3 keys of NAPE member engagement, which is discover, exchanging knowledge about what works and what doesn't, connect, something like this meeting, for example, which is adapting equity solutions that create and sustain new partnerships as needed, and taking action, which lead to implementing solutions, monitoring progress through policy solutions, and continuously improve through advocacy. So NAPE membership is more than just NAPE PD. It's about discover, connect, and take action. Want to learn more about that? Give me a call. These are some examples of what NAPE membership looks like. We have 1 hour, we have 1 day plus, and then we have 6-month engagement opportunities at NAPE. And the 1 hour engagement opportunities is through community, like these web-based events, like this particular meeting. For example, we have 1 day plus, which are our in-person events and different kinds of partner collaboration. An example being the NAPE Annual Summit, where you have more than a day of opportunities to build community, to connect, to engage. And then we have what are long-term 6-month plus NAPE engagement opportunities, which are coming together on long-term projects through our NAPE committees. And you'll learn more about NAPE committees. We're going to do an announcement about opportunities through NAPE committees coming up really soon after the holiday break. But just a general overview, our committees are a key tool for building our community among us in this equity sphere. Our committees are challenge focused and they're outcome driven, they're cross-functional, they're time bound. So we have particular areas of interest that are time bound. We try to present on the work coming in the spring, particularly around the time of the summit, and there are opportunities for committees to present during that time. And NAPE staff are supported, provide support and infrastructure and the scaffolding for these meetings. So there'll be opportunity to work through Google Docs and other kinds of things, so you don't have to worry about them, as well as setting up the Zoom invites and those kinds of things. So NAPE provides staff provides the scaffolding, and collectively we build community through engagement around our committee work. So coming to today, what brings us here? The topic is storytelling and humanizing data in CTE. And we start all our meetings with just a point of reflection. I just want to take a minute for you to take a minute and just reflect on what resonates with you on this particular topic. What brings you here? What are you interested in learning, or just what resonates with you? And if you can put that in the chat, we're just going to take a minute, but if you can put that in the chat so that collectively we can all see kind of where we're coming from, what brought you here, and what do you hope to get? What resonates with you on this particular topic? So we'll just take a minute, and please use the chat. We have a quiet bunch today. Must be the eggnog. Oh, here we go. All right, there's some interesting things here. Thank you so much for sharing, everybody. Wonderful. All right. We're going to keep moving on, but please continue to share. I mean, this is another opportunity to build community, to understand where we're all coming from, and our panel probably could also appreciate understanding what you hope to gain from this conversation. So here's our agenda. We're going to move on to introductions, and I'm going to turn this panel over to our CEO, Brittany Brady. And so there'll be opportunity for you to meet this really wonderful panel. I had a chance to chat with them just before we came on, and this is a dynamic bunch. So we really appreciate all of you taking the time to join us. So I'm not going to walk through the agenda. You can see it here. We're going to do the panel talk. There's going to be an opportunity for you as participants to provide Q&A. So as we're going through this conversation, please take any note that you need to make. But it's very important for us to hear your voice, for your voice to be heard at these meetings. That's part of the purpose of this. So the Q&A, we're going to have plenty of time for that. And then we're going to mention something about saving the date for January for our next meeting. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany Brady. And Brittany, you'll take it from here. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can get straight to folks. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Gregory.
There you go.
And so happy to be here with you all today. As Gregory mentioned, we do have an esteemed panel this morning, afternoon, whatever time we find you, right here at the top of the holiday season. First, we have Liz Texera, who is currently a fellow in the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, OCTAE, our friends at OCTAE at the U.S. Department of Education. Liz was most recently director of the Office of Career and College and Career Readiness for the Rhode Island Department of Ed, where she managed a large team responsible for some of our favorite things: CTE, early college opportunities, adult basic education, statewide school counseling, computer science for Rhode Island, the All Course Network, and the interagency Prepare Rhode Island initiative. Liz's experience spans secondary and post-secondary, domestic and international, and we are so grateful to have you here with us today, Liz. Up next, we have Dan Adams, who is our friend from Advanced CTE. Dan is currently Associate Director for Data and Research and leads that team in responsible data quality. Some of their initiatives include promoting data-driven decision-making among state CTE leaders and within the organization. Dan began his career as a middle school STEM teacher and now works along the continuum of education. And then last but certainly not least, Dr. Kevin Johnson Sr. Serves as Senior Advisor at Advanced CTE. His professional interests are CTE data policy, school law, school finance, P12 education leadership. As the current member of the Association for Career and Technical Education, Inclusion, Access, Equity, and Diversity Advisory Group member and mentor, I can speak from personal experience. Dr. Johnson is really a wonderful person to encourage leaders in really advancing equity. Dr. Johnson most recently served as a statewide CTE coordinator at the Texas Education Agency in the CCMR division. And so we have this wonderful panel here to talk about humanizing data. As you all can tell, they are more than equipped to share in detail about really the impact of what it means when we humanize data. What does it mean when we really understand that every number is a human being, and that the decisions that we make when we're data driven, that means that we're learner and student driven. And so it's really an opportunity for us to focus on what success looks like. So I joked with Liz before this meeting and said, we need some warm fuzzies before the holiday season. And so we're going to talk about success. We're also going to talk about opportunities and challenges. And to get us started, I'm going to pass it over to you, Liz, to share a little bit from the department. And thank you so much to the Department of Education for showing up to this meeting today. And of course, to our friends here at Advanced CTE.
Thank you so much for having me today, Brittany. It is a pleasure to be here all with you today. To start, I'm going to actually share my screen and go over a couple of kind of high-level initiatives that the Department of Education is prioritizing this year through Secretary Cardona's leadership. And then I'm going to do, we'll say, a medium-sized dive into the initiative that I run for the department called Unlocking Career Success. So give me 1 second to share screen here. All right. Is everyone able to see what I'm looking at on my screen? Excellent. So raise the bar, lead the world. That is the overarching priorities for Secretary Cardona. And last year in January, the Secretary kind of outlined what his major priorities were going to be for his administration at the department. And one thing that we were really, really grateful for, again, specifically coming from my lane, again, as Brittany mentioned, previously I was the Director of College and Career Readiness for the Rhode Island Department of Education, overseeing CTE, was the emphasis on career-connected learning and pathways. That came about when we kind of outlined what the major priorities for the department would be for the coming year. So achieve academic excellence. There are two kind of primary objectives within that vertical: accelerated learning, delivering a comprehensive and rigorous education for every student, obviously both based on data and data stemming out of the pandemic. The second vertical is around boldly improving learning outcomes. So specifically, again, those two that we're focusing on are eliminating the educator shortage for schools and investing in every student's mental health and well-being. So again, you'll notice that all of these data points can be tracked back to some of the data that we have seen over the past couple of years coming out of our educational systems. And then finally, creating pathways for global engagement. And that is where I kind of find myself in this initiative. So ensuring that every student has a pathway to college and career is one of our priority initiatives at the department. And we'll talk more about that in a second, but also around making sure that every student has a pathway to multilingualism. One thing that Secretary Cardona is fond of saying is that multilingualism is actually a superpower, right? And we need to be doing everything in our power to make sure that our students have access to multiple languages and they have the exposure that they need to be successful with whatever they choose to do next. So to go over some quick background, and like I said, to do a bit of a medium dive into unlocking career success, we know that the world has changed, and we know that our systems are not changing right now fast enough to keep up with how that world has changed. We also know that most of the jobs that are going to exist today are not going to exist the next 10, 15, 20 years. The world is changing rapidly. And in order to keep up, we need to make sure that we are being nimble and adaptive and using data to make decisions about how we prepare our systems. We also know that in the next couple of years, actually by 2027, most of our jobs, those good jobs that we talk about, are going to require some sort of education or training beyond, again, our traditional high school experience. So right now we're trying to think through, what does that look like when most jobs are going to require some sort of post-secondary degree or credential? And for reference in this conversation, I consider a college degree another type of post-secondary credential. So we're thinking through, how do we make sure that all of our different systems, and when I talk about the different systems, I'm going to prioritize our K-12 system, our system of higher education, and our workforce system. How do we make sure that they're actually working together to make sure that our students are prepared to not only enter the workforce, but also get a job that's going to provide a family-sustaining wage for themselves and their families? So right now, again, we have a unique moment in time. We have an unprecedented amount of federal funding flowing into our states through the Invest in America efforts, IIA. So CHIPS, bill, IRA, those are massive infusions of cash that can actually be used for workforce development, and specifically youth workforce development funding, which we'll talk about in a second. But right now, for this initiative, our goal is to make sure that every single high school student comes equipped with some key things that they need in order to be successful in this new world that we're looking at. So that initiative is called Unlocking Career Success. And again, it is this administration's really intentional foray into pathways programming. Now, pathways will be a familiar term to this audience. So to make sure that I'm being careful about the language that I'm using, when I talk about a pathway, what I mean is that every single student that we serve is going to land in a career someday. We all take a different pathway to get there. What that pathway looks like is different for everyone, right? As many students as there are in our country are as many different pathways as we need to define and make sure are available to our students. They're being supported through that pathway. So for unlocking career success specifically, we're trying to figure out how to blur those lines between, again, traditional high school, traditional college, and career. We're doing that by prioritizing 4 different kind of key policy areas. And again, given the audience today, none of these are going to be a surprise to anyone on the line. 1, dual enrollment, making sure that our students have early access to college credit while they're still with us in high school. We know in our research and our data shows us, and again, we have done extensive research and gotten lots of data on this fact, that students who have early exposure to dual enrollment credits actually are statistically significantly more likely to graduate from their counterparts, with their peers, matriculate into college, persist through, and complete. However, we also know, and this is actually some of the research that I received through my time in Rhode Island, that for our students who want to go directly into the workforce, if they have exposure to dual enrollment while they're in high school, they are actually more likely to graduate from high school as well. So again, dual enrollment is a winner. We know that it is a strategy that works for our students. We're trying to make sure that we're developing policies and programs that help facilitate it. The second is around work-based learning, right? So again, one of our favorites here, making sure that our students have early exposure to real-world experiences and knowing that we have to be starting earlier, right? We can't be waiting until they get to the end of their high school experience to start talking about what do they want their future to look like. When we think about work-based learning, we're trying to think about a continuum, right? We're thinking about starting really early, right? In elementary school with career awareness. What does it look like? What am I interested in? Talking about getting some exposure to different careers and some experience, and then eventually getting to expertise through career and technical education. So again, this kind of continuum of work-based learning is something that we're really trying to solidify through policies and through our work with states. The third is around workforce credentials. So making sure that our students who do want to go directly into the world of work, that they actually have a competitive edge when they get there, and that any time and energy that they're spending on getting a credential is a credential of value that is tied to a high wage, high demand career field. We have all seen that since the pandemic, there's been this proliferation of credentials. We're trying to make sure that the credentials that our students are getting are actually going to be worth something and help put them on a trajectory for success. An escalator of wages, an escalator of opportunity. That's what we're trying to think about when we think about workforce credentials. And then fourth and final, career advising and navigation. We all know that we need to be doing a better job of making sure that our students are actually prepared for and aware of the opportunity that lies outside of the K-12 experience. They need to be able to make informed decisions about what they do after high school. If a student is going directly into the world of work because they're not academically prepared for college, we're not doing our job. If they're going directly into college because they were not aware of a workforce development training or opportunity program, we're also not doing our job. Our job is to make sure that our students are aware of the world of possibility, not to winnow that world down. So these are kind of the 4 different, we call them the keys to unlocking career success, because we believe that these are the things that are going to be most likely to give our students success, and they're all backed by data and research. So how are we actually operationalizing those policies, right? I've talked about policies, I've talked about states. This last year was the first year of the initiative, and we focused on 4 primary work streams. The first, and I'll come back to this in a little while during our questions, is around practical tools and playbooks. Coming from a state background, I knew once I got here that I wanted to make sure that we were able to create tools that other state leaders could use to help advance those 4 keys. So we spent a lot of our time developing a searchable database of tools from national leaders to make sure that if you were looking for a resource tagged to one of those 4 keys, you could find it easily and efficiently. Second, communities of practice. We recognize that here at the federal level, we need to be thinking and hearing directly from the field. What is going well in the states? What is going well for LEAs? What is happening for our students on the ground? So this past year, we ran both an urban COP. So again, some of our largest districts were a part of that work, telling us about their pathways programming. And we also ran a rural community of practice with 12 districts from across the nation. Because again, sometimes the strategies that we are using for our urban communities need to be different for our rural communities. Third, summits and exemplars. So again, I'll touch on this a little bit here, but we'll come back to it later. We really wanted to make sure that we are convening groups of state level leadership to talk about pathways programming to make sure that the systems were cohesive and aligned across, again, K-12, higher ed, and workforce. So we ran a series of summits this past summer where over 500 state reps came and actually got to hear from some of our sister federal agencies about some of the workforce development funding available to them. And finally, we ran a Career Connected High School grant, so a $25 million grant competition to help LEAs, again, kind of pull together these different pieces into a cohesive plan. We're getting ready to announce the winners in the next couple of weeks. So I'm not going to go over this slide here. I'm happy to talk about some of the key work that we've accomplished to date, but we are very excited to be talking about year 2 of the initiative. And humanizing data is one of the most important things that we're going to be doing as part of this work. So here in year 2, we're going to be releasing finalized playbooks. So again, more to come on that a little bit later. We're going to be releasing and supporting our Career Connected High School grant. We're doing a bunch of follow-up right now with states, right, to talk about, again, some of the different funding opportunities available to them. And finally, we're going to be working more directly with our employers on talent pipeline development. So again, lots to come in this next year, but again, I'm going to leave it there. I have a QR code here. So if you open up your phone into your camera and you toggle onto this QR code, it will actually bring you to the Unlocking Career Success website where you can see more, access this resource database, see some of the funding opportunities available, and my email is below as well. So again, looking forward to the conversation today, and thank you for your time, letting me talk and do a bit of a medium dive here into Unlocking Career Success.
Thank you, Liz. And that's a nice entry point into our first question, where we really want to start off. One of the main benefits, I think, in terms of humanizing data is really learning the true story of impact, right? And when thinking about the Unlocking Career Success Toolkit and all of the exemplars you all have sourced, can you get our conversation started with one of your favorite stories that led to impact?
Absolutely. It's such a good question also because it lets me kind of plug the playbooks even more. Right now on the website, we have 8 of the 12 kind of playbooks listed. And when I say playbook, what I mean is we were really intentional about making sure that we were developing these short 2 to 3 page kind of implementation memos for key stakeholders. So we have memos for governors, principals, superintendents, counselors, CTE directors, students and families, higher education, state education agencies. Again, right now we're up to 13, and I'm pretty sure we're getting more this year as well. But right now we have early versions of those playbooks on the website. The whole point here was if you were a new state CTE director, what are the top 4 or 5 things that you need to know and how to leverage your data in order to move this pathway system forward? So again, there are kind of 4 or 5 steps in each of these playbooks. It says things that you should be thinking about and considering as you begin this work. And most importantly, it includes stories. It includes exemplars. It includes people who are already doing this work. So if you see something that you like, you are able to now reach out to that LEA or that principal or that superintendent to find out what did they do, how did they do it, and how can you replicate it. We know at the department, right, that one of the kind of, I think, key functionalities that we have is the bully pulpit, right? And being able to highlight and shine a light on the amazing work happening nationwide. So again, I get to hear about incredible stories all the time in Pathways work, but one of my favorites has to be a study visit that I actually did out to Chicago. We got to see the Chicago roadmap in action. And we actually referenced the Chicago roadmap in our mayor's playbook, talking about the importance of creating kind of cross-cutting initiatives. And basically, Chicago roadmap is a initiative between Chicago Public Schools, the city colleges of Chicago, and some philanthropy to make sure that students are supported kind of on their journeys to a post-secondary plan. So we got to go to Sarah H. Good STEM Academy, and we got to hear from all of the students who were doing incredible work, but also that they were able to access career counselors, for example, that spanned K-12 and post-secondary. They were able to have early exposure, and they were able to understand the deadlines about how to apply to college. They had access to career exploration activities early and often. All of those 4 things that I talked about before is something that they were really honing in on as part of this work and as part of this project. And that was because, again, the mayor, the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, the higher ed leadership and philanthropy got together, sat in a room, and were like, what do we need to do to make sure that our students are successful, right? What are the things that if we all play together, we can make sure that our kids get in order to be successful? And we actually got to see some of those students and the success that they were having. It was absolutely incredible. So I think that one of my favorite stories is obviously, again, talking to students and getting to see the work that they get to do. And that happens as a result of adults working together, right? And some of those cross-cutting initiatives and being able to put away some of like the territory concerns, some of the funding issues, and just sitting in a room and talking like, what do we need to do to make sure that these kids get what they deserve? That is what I like to see. So again, that's, I think, one of my favorites that I've seen recently.
Thank you. And we love collaboration. And I'm going to move us around a little bit because that actually segues really nicely into my question for our representatives here from Advanced CTE, which is when we're thinking about data informing decision making, right? Liz gave the example of bringing all of these adults in the room to work together for students. When thinking about that and broader initiative, what role does storytelling play in those environments? What qualitative and quantitative data do you feel informs that process, Dr. Johnson and Dan?
So, and I love the title of this, and Liz, I could have listened to that all day. So great to hear the work that's being done at the department. But I think we're more of a ground level, boots on the ground conversation that I'll have about some of the things that we're doing. And I'd like to talk in particular, especially having a conversation about humanizing data and our process to getting there. As we work with states on the opportunity gap analysis workshop, the one thing we do and we start our workshops with is one, the equity conversation, making sure that an implicit bias conversation is being had. We go through the strength-based versus deficit-based thinking. How do you humanize those data points, realizing that those are individuals that you're taking? You want to start with data, but realize that you're still dealing with humans. So we go through that process with opportunity gap analysis. But also from there, after they take a look at their data points, there's a conversation around the root cause analysis, and who do you bring to that table to have those conversations within those LEAs, at those agencies or institutions? And the great thing about our process and building from the work from Perkins, and of course with those minimal participant lists, but also making sure we realize that the community is engaged in that conversation. As we work with at this time, we've had close to 35 states that have participated in opportunity gap analysis training in the workshop. And we're emphasizing to them, and we have emphasized to them, that who you bring to the table is important, that representation. That if you're telling a story, that you're telling everyone's story, and that you're telling stories from those communities, and you're allowing them to participate and be a part of the process. The favorite colloquial term, having a seat at the table. Then after that, as we're working with the states, they go through the root cause analysis, they're driving, constructing their plans, their action plans. We're also having extended conversations of, hey, report back those successes. And then we're working with them on how we can now tell those stories through blogs, through resources, developing toolkits and playbooks, similar to what was shared by Octave, of how we're making sure that they're exemplars, right? Because we're all seeking for information and processes and promising practices by which to inform how we're ensuring that, again, we're giving access to all learners, but talking to our administrators, teachers, and our agency leaders about how that process, how exemplars of how that can happen. So that's just one example of the work that we're doing here at Advanced CTE, and I'll now hand it over to Dan to talk about a few of our other practices and policies that we have in place.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Johnson. I'm going to actually go back a little bit in time too, before I came to Advanced CTE. I was the statewide director of career pathways and before that was the secondary Perkins data specialist for the state of Oregon. One thing I learned in that time, and I come back to this over and over again, is that descriptive data don't answer questions definitively. They are certainly not going to tell you why, and they may not even tell you how, which is not the same as descriptive data don't have a really important role to play. But it's important that we are clear about what that role is and that we're using them in the way that they can be helpful. So what I come back to over and over again is descriptive data aren't going to answer questions definitively, but they can identify, I like to think of them as like rocks we should be looking under. Like you see anomalous data, it's not going to tell you what's happening there, but it can tell you where you need to look. And just to be clear, that looking under the rock could involve qualitative research. It can involve randomized control trials. There's a lot of things you can do to sort of understand what's causing the anomaly. For the purposes of our conversation today, I'm going to focus more on the qualitative aspect. I'm going to air all my own dirty laundry here. So when I was in Oregon, my very first year, I was asked to publish a research brief on what was happening in the career pathways data for the state of Oregon, and specifically whether there were any districts who appeared to be doing a really good job. I'm not going to name any names here. So I looked at my data and I found the district that was doing the best And at that point, I'd done my work, so I published the report. What I learned the next week is that the thing about an annual report is that once you hit send, you're stuck with it for the next 364 days or 365 days next year. And it turned out, as I continued to dig into the data that I was using, it turned out that for this district that I featured, their CTE students just weren't representative of students district-wide. And so I had to wait a year, but I got another opportunity. And this time around, I made really sure that the success I was seeing in the data wasn't because of who had access and who was being selected for a career in technical education. And after that, I met with representatives. I made time to meet with superintendents, CTE administrators. I wasn't actually able to reach students in that round of conversations, but I really tried to understand what was going on. I couldn't explain how they were doing what they were doing, but the data were really clear that their success wasn't because of the students they were serving and not serving. Their success was something else. So I brought a lot of curiosity to that conversation to try to figure out what was under the rock. How are they doing this thing that looked kind of amazing to an outsider? And those were some really fruitful conversations. More recently, Advanced CTE has something called the Post-Secondary Data Quality Institute. And that's a grant that goes out to states to support post-secondary work. I need to be really honest. I was not involved with this version of the Post-Secondary Data Quality Institute, or we call it PDI internally. I didn't contribute to this work, but there are actually folks on this call who did. So if you have questions about PDI 1.0, my hope is that they might be willing to help answer. But what happened in that grant is that each semester, faculty at the University of the District of Columbia Community College grade students on their midterm course performance. And an unsatisfactory rating means that a student is unlikely to pass. And what they found was that statistic is actually somewhat predictive. So in the fall of 2020, of the learners receiving an unsatisfactory, 77% went on to withdraw or earn a final course grade of D or F. So again, those data don't tell us what's causing the problem, but they do indicate that there's an anomaly over here, and we should bring curiosity to conversations with those who have more direct experience to really understand what's happening and therefore what we might be able to do about it. So through the grant, they did some surveying of the learners themselves, and the feedback really gave insights that shaped how faculty interacted with students in the future. From the surveys, they heard students say they need to schedule one-on-one time with students who are observed to be struggling. Instructors could flex office hours to accommodate work schedules, arrange private meetings that would sort of help surface technology, financial, work challenges, et cetera, that were having an impact on success in school, but weren't directly related to academics. So this is a really good example of recognizing the value of engaging student voice. College administrators continued to conduct midterm surveys and communicating, and were involved with communicating results on an ongoing basis. So I think what I can bring to this conversation is that descriptive data are really important, but they are never enough. And descriptive data will be useful in sort of surfacing anomalies, surfacing places where more time and resources may be needed. But we really need to speak to the people most directly involved, to speak with the people most directly impacted, to understand which resources, which interventions, which additional support may be helpful to the folks who are actually involved.
Thank you for that, Dan. And I mean, I can echo what both of you said, because, as at NAPE, with our Equity Leadership Academy for states, when we think about lifting up that rock and getting curious with root cause analysis, that's what NAPE has done since inception, right? Is really getting curious, especially about those equity roots, because most root causes have some level of systemic barrier or some systemic connection to why we're seeing what we are. And I, especially as a native of the DC metropolitan area, of course, love the UDC example, but also love that curiosity around, okay, we have a somewhat deficit-based frame of these are students who are not going to persist. How can we support their future success by humanizing them? And instead of taking what would be a more deficit-based route of saying, okay, what do we do for remediation or something like that? Instead thinking, what can we do to really see how we can support this student via one-on-one engagement, via other implementation of practices? And that is really the intention of this space today and why members of NAPE are asking for more about humanizing data. It's examples like the one that you raised, Dan, of saying, okay, the numbers are saying this, but what are the humans saying, right? With our Equity Leadership Academy for States, we have learners involved, right? We have actual students on those teams. It holds you accountable to hear directly from your learners. Yes, we have this initiative for our community college or for our institution, but hey, learner, is this actually something that's realistic? You were seen as unsatisfactory. Who wants to be unsatisfactory, right? Instead, what do you need to be supported here, right? How can we humanize your experience to really give you what you need to be successful? With that in mind, I want to get us to the point of thinking of what are some of the barriers to humanizing data? And one of the ones that we've assessed, and I'll just speak for me so I don't throw anybody else under the bus, but sometimes we want to make numbers show a lot of impact, right? And sometimes the hesitation about qualitative stories is it's not as big as a large, juicy number. However, I want Liz to get us started, and then please, folks from Advanced CTE weigh in. But when we're thinking about humanizing data, can you share ways that people have had solutions-oriented approaches that brave funding in new and innovative ways? Most of those things hinge on humanizing data and then thinking of, okay, we need someone from Voc Rehab, we need someone from this department, we need somebody from that department, because the data is showing that it's a multi-layered issue. And so if you can share a little bit about that, either from where you sit now, Liz, or even from your wonderful history as a leader of CTE in Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the most useful frameworks that I have utilized in both roles, right here at the federal level and at the state level, was kind of talking about like a framework for what is the level of support and like how are we humanizing data across 4 different levels. The first being something around like supportive strategies. That usually is like funding, policy, et cetera. Is there a supportive environment, and what story is that telling us? We can get certain data points from policy, we can get certain data points from funding. Like supportive environment is kind of like level 1. Level 2 is based on that, who actually has access to this, right? The data that we're getting about who is accessing our programs, our policies, our initiatives, our funding, et cetera. That's kind of like level 2. Level 3, when we talk about it, is okay, now that we know who has access, who's actually participating, right? Because data can hide, right? Like it can be hidden, and like data can hide a really important story. So we can't just look at like, do we have the supportive structures? Do I have a program? Do I have funding? We can't just say, okay, well, it's a statewide initiative or it's a federal program, so everyone gets access. The next level is, okay, who's actually participating? And if they're not participating in the way that we want them to, why not, right? We have to go deeper than that initial data point. And then I'd say the fourth one is performance. Okay, once we know what the environment is, the supportive structures, now we know who actually has access to this, and we hope it's everyone, but if not, why not? Then we say, okay, who's actually participating? How are they actually performing, right? Are there differences in our student populations? Are there differences in who actually is doing well based on what we're giving them? And if not, we have to go into a feedback cycle to understand where we went wrong, right? Like where are we not hitting the mark? So I think that one of the most helpful structures that I have like utilized is thinking about those 4 different kind of levels: support, access, participation, and then performance. And that kind of keeping those 4 in mind has really helped me not get lulled by what I'm thinking is a story that I'm seeing in my data. It also helps me to humanize it. When I was in Rhode Island, we were seeing great like increases in AP participation, for example, and we had to dig a little bit deeper to make sure that we were telling the appropriate story. There were still equity gaps in that data. So again, the story was not, it was a wonderful story about improvements across the board, but it wasn't across the board. It was about, again, certain subpopulations. So again, I think that using that framework has really helped me kind of dig into like the different levels about like what data is telling us and what it's not telling us, and why we have to dig a little bit deeper into the actual stories behind those data points, right? Our students. So again, framework is, I think, a really big part of it. And again, I went totally off book there. I was not talking about funding at all, but in terms of actually being flexible with funding, thinking about those different levels has helped me actually figure out how I want to leverage funding effectively. Am I thinking about it from a supportive perspective? Am I thinking about it as like an access tool? Am I thinking about it as a performance tool, right? Like, how am I actually leveraging that? Specifically, as part of Unlocking Career Success, we actually ran a series of summits, like I mentioned, this past summer, where we really wanted states to think through, with the end of pandemic era funds coming up, how can you be leveraging some of this historic funding that is coming out right now as a result of Invest in America? So CHIPS, Bill, IRA, we partner with our different federal sister agencies, Departments of Commerce, Labor, Transportation, and Energy, to actually talk to our state leaders about, here are pots of funds that we wish you were utilizing for workforce development, right? Here are some opportunities for funding that we think you should be leveraging to actually kind of deepen your impact in this career connected space. So on that website that I put in the chat earlier, we actually have a funding opportunities page where you can see it's updated quarterly. So some of the deadlines have passed, but there are some upcoming opportunities for additional funding opportunities. People can think creatively about how to fund their initiatives and their work. And we also have presentations from those sister agencies about those specific initiatives. So if you're trying to figure out, how can I leverage like bipartisan infrastructure law funding for workforce development, we've got it in there. If you're trying to think about, how is like CHIPS going to be connected to my program of study moving forward, we've got something there from Commerce as well. So again, really trying to make sure that we are helping provide the information to our stakeholders so they can be creative about braiding and leveraging funds effectively.
Thank you. And I saw the head nods when you talked about how data can hide things. Go ahead, Dr. Johnson, weigh in.
Absolutely. And something that really has to be looked at, and I'll go a bit off script and I do want to get to some braiding funding examples, but when you're looking at states, and I won't name any state in particular, but when you're taking a look at how you are grouping, and I'll use one example, I'm taking a look at an MOA process within the state had within a group individuals who were homeless or foster youth, in the same group with military connected. That's masking, right? That the homeless and foster, because they have different challenges to someone that's military connected. That we're careful about, right? Our data points, our processes. I really wanted to highlight that. But for the braided funding conversation, with the opportunity of Perkins plans being reauthorized or redesigned, we owe around this time that there are a few states that have combined state plans, and I can definitely send you a list of those who may be interested. But just taking a look at how we can now meld and then mend these systems to ensure that we're working together right through our process. And I'll use that as an example in Texas. Texas decided to use the Texas workforce, individuals that were called career specialists. These career specialists are embedded within high schools, right? And that's a use of not only and focusing on CTE pathway students, but they took that opportunity to, yes, you have a counselor, yes, there's a CTE director, CTE teacher, but now we're going to bring in someone from a workforce scope and have a conversation about that entire career pathway. That there are some innovative solutions being developed across the country that could really make use of, one, the great amount of additional funding that's available, but also to think about those practices, because it's just not the job of the counselor to have that conversation about, okay, what does that career pathway look like? And we won't even get into the counselor to student ratios. That's a whole nother discussion. But that there's an opportunity to think about, to be innovative and rethink how information is provided to our learners. And I don't want to just think K-12, but also to our adult learners, because that's often a population that's left out in this process. We had a fellow that was a part of our fellowship here at Advanced CTE, sponsored by ECMCF, that looked at in her state that there were over 1 million unemployed adults within that state, but there were no direct outreach and processes for those populations. So as we're thinking about, right, humanizing data, looking for opportunities, let's not forget to think about the entire continuum of learners, and ensuring that there are practices and processes in place and opportunities to braid funding where possible, to have those discussions about ensuring that you think about them from not only from K-12, but post-secondary, or even our reskilling and upskilling adult learners.
Thank you for that. And we really, I mean, our last member meeting was about supporting adult learners. So we are firm believers in supporting learners at every age and stage because it's essential, especially when thinking about more equitable practice, right? I really love what you mentioned about kind of disaggregating the data. If we're masking some of our outcomes by looking at a holistic group, then how can we pull things apart? Of course, with mindfulness around people's privacy, but if there's a way to think about the many different intersections of someone's lived experience that we can support, then we can be developing more thoughtful and expansive solutions. And so I want to give it a moment. Thank you again to the panel. You all are just so amazing and doing this right before the holidays. I can't thank you all enough. I want to give the audience a chance to ask any questions that they may have. Feel free to put them in the chat. And then those that have been to our member meetings before know that we try to keep it pretty familiar and communal. So if you want to come off mute and ask your question, we welcome that as well. So I'll give folks a moment to ask a question. And oh, thank you so much. We have a question here in the chat from Ashley. Says, how does humanizing data directly connect to anti-racism efforts and effectively removing systemic barriers for students of color, especially given students of color are not explicitly named a special population under Perkins 5? Thank you, Ashley, for that question. And yes, this is very true. It's not specifically called out, nor is gender, even though it's falling under non-traditional career, gender kind of comes in that way. So thanks for raising that, Ashley. Does anyone want to weigh in on that question?
I would quickly. There is an opportunity from the subpopulation conversation, right? That's identified from the groups within ESSA. When you think about closing the gaps and that conversation from the Perkins 5 language, and that's something that we emphasize also within the OGA training, that when you talk about, and I get it, there is a realization that in some states there is a restrictive language. So we tend to lean on the Perkins 5 language from that standpoint. But there's also within our training, we talk about implicit bias. That's why we go through the deficit versus strength-based to really check those biases as they begin that training, to really talk about what is the true meaning of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what does that look like to actualize that? What does it look like to have an equity-focused framework to the work that you're conducting? And then I think the greater piece for me is, who are you bringing to the table? I want to reemphasize that again, that as we begin these analysis of our programs, analysis of systems, that we're including the populations that we truly want to serve, which is a missing element at times, that you have individuals making decisions for populations and not including those populations. And I think that's the way to really address that. Instead of having someone speak for them, invite them to the table and allow you to tell them what their challenges are and what they're experiencing.
So Dr. Johnson said to humanize the data, invite the humans. Okay, I hear you. We have another question. And that was the question I was going to ask, Gregory. Are there untapped opportunities or innovative approaches to humanizing data that you believe hold great potential for the future? So kind of future casting it. What could we be doing? And I kind of, not to put you on the spot, Dan, but I know we've had conversations about this before. I want to see if you might want to start answering this question.
I was trying not to make eye contact, Brittany, because I was afraid you were going to call him. I noticed you said Kevin was nodding his head earlier. You're calling him. I've been trying to hold my head real still. No, I'm just playing. This is a tough one because I think the truth is different states are bringing different experience and resources to data work, and are bringing different environments where what's allowed in the conversation and what's not allowed in the conversation is really relevant as we wrap up 2023. I mean, it feels like a cop-out, but I do genuinely believe that it wouldn't hurt any state to spend time looking at their definitions and really thinking about what is being counted and who is being counted, and what is being excluded and who is being excluded. I don't think any state has access to all of the data that they need to, going back to the earlier question, to be effectively anti-racist. Brittany mentioned intersectionality before. I do think in the future, one of the conversations we're trying to lead at Advanced CTE is we typically talk about students as having one relevant identity at a time. And we know that's not the lives our students lead. It's not the lives we lead. I don't show up to this conversation as either white or male. I show up as both, and people interact with me because they perceive both. And so I think, I don't know if it's an untapped opportunity or if it's something that's just not explicitly required, but I do think some really important work is ahead of us in the next 5 years to be able to acknowledge that in a space like in a space like career and technical education, that our students are simultaneously experiencing multiple identities and people are interacting with their multiple identities simultaneously. And so I think being able to better describe those experiences in the data, not just in the data, but I heard you say before, like, what do the data say, but what do the actual humans say? So that we can, again, see in the data whom our systems are not yet serving well, and then speak with those students directly to find out what do they need from us in order to not only succeed in a secondary, post-secondary career and technical education program, but in their careers, right? If we keep training classes that are 50-50 and graduating them into industries that are 90-10, there is more equity work for us to do. So I think, like, there's always more room to expand whom your data are sort of highlighting. And in that process, I think we need to be really strategic in the near future about highlighting multiple identities and being able to better describe the actual lived experience of students in career and technical education programs.
And you didn't want me to call on you and listen to that beautiful answer. See, that's why I called on you, Dan. And I'm in absolute agreement with what you shared. I mean, in my beautiful world, everyone could describe themselves as themselves, and we would just kind of adapt the systems to do what they need. Liz mentioned the pathways. Pathways should be as expansive as every unique pathway. That is a really ambitious, but also a visionary approach, because we are all unique. We all bring different experiences that are going to impact how we are experiencing, especially career and technical education, where things are challenging. And it's really an exciting opportunity economically as well, if we get this right, in terms of, really learning who we can serve more holistically. So I just want to thank the panel again. We just have a few more minutes left. I'm going to bring Gregory back, but thank you again to our esteemed panelists. We cannot do these member meetings without you. And when thinking of bringing experts, you all immediately came to mind. And so thank you for sharing with our members and offering what they've asked us for. And Gregory, I'll go ahead and add you to the spotlight. Oh, you're muted.
Hey. I just said some wonderful stuff, which I won't be able to repeat. Yeah, I just wanted to share my screen here, and I want to echo what Brittany just shared. I want to thank everybody who came to join us for this call, and I want to thank the panelists. There was some really rich dialogue, and I know we could have gone another hour, but these are tight meetings, and really it's an opportunity to generate more conversation residually. Before I pass things on, it seems like someone has their hand up. Is there someone with a question? Jeremy Nichols?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm a videographer, storyteller for the Wisconsin Technical College system. And so the reason I wanted to ask this question is that, I'm thinking of how to use the data and the information you're giving when doing video stories, which my goal in video stories, I think all of us, is to give the viewer, a feeling as opposed to trying to make them remember numbers. And I'm curious what any of your perspectives are on marrying those two things, where yes, you want them to know the number, but you really want them to leave with a feeling of what can be done, or what they could do about it. Does anybody have any thoughts or suggestions of how you marry those two concepts? Or is that for a different conversation?
I
Go
can
ahead,
just
Dan.
answer real quick. I mean, I don't know the comprehensive answer to that, but I think one of the roles of data is sort of to, as best we can, describe what's happening right now, what the current reality looks like. And one of the great features of video is that you can help show a future that we're not quite at yet. So one thing I would encourage you to do is to be aware of the data, understand what the data say, to represent the data where necessary. But also, as you sort of talk about a feeling you want people to have, I would want all of our career and technical education students to feel welcomed, to feel like we are ready to help them succeed. The systems are in place to help them succeed, for students to see themselves in the video, so that when they're having that feeling, it's connected to an identity that they carry and they feel is important. So I'm not a videographer. I've never done videography before, but I think one of the advantages you have over me is I am sort of confined to reality, whereas you can sort of help us create the future we're trying to create.
And I'll just piggyback really briefly and say yes to all of that, and thinking from a visionary lens, when thinking of evoking emotion, like especially speaking of the students that you might be able to have access to, since you're partnered with that system, seeing if you can get actual students that can share about their experiences is always so compelling. And then bringing in the data point that contextualizes that person's lived experience. So this person is one of 75% of students with this experience. People will remember Jeremy, but they'll also remember that stat that they were offered about what happened for that student. So really that context, bringing that in, that authenticity also adds to that lens of the humanization of the data, because people are saying, oh, I think I saw that person walking across campus, or oh, I saw this person at such and such, kind of, as much as it's allowed and appropriate, but I would recommend that as well. And then I also put my email in the chat in case you want to speak more. We've put together a few video resources with Toyota through their Make the Future initiative. And so we'd love to connect you with maybe that team if you would want to. So feel free to reach out to me, Jeremy. And that's what these member meetings are about, for us to learn from one another. So thank you for asking the question that you really needed to ask. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. And on that note, I just want to wrap things up. I want to let folks know we have our next meeting on January 17th, 3 p.m. Eastern, empowering young women in non-traditional career environments. And that will be a great opportunity to elevate that youth voice, something that we were talking about, and contextualize some of the data points that we've been talking about as well. Before we go, I just want to publicly acknowledge Kathy Albin, who is the chair of the Member Engagement Committee. Committees are how we get these topics put together, and with input from our other members. I want to acknowledge Jonathan Wickert as well, and some of our other what we call NAPE pace setters. And I also want to acknowledge in our meeting our NAPE past president, Adrian San Miguel. Thank you for joining us, Adrian, and bringing your folks from Iowa. We're really happy to have you. So we're at time now, and I'm going to leave this chat open just in case you want to take a minute or two to share with each other. And but I'm going to stop recording now. And if you have to go, you have to go. Thank you very much. Take care and happy holidays.